Well, I think I was kind of, Ron kind of designated me as the opening act here. So I mentioned briefly to you earlier, and I'm going to repeat that I actually attended the AWP conference in Philadelphia. It's only my third conference ever. And the publisher of my first book, Lucy Lang Day, was, she wanted to do a poetry of place reading, and she invited me, and she really urged me, it's okay, go ahead, you can fly, and blah blah blah, because COVID is still an issue. So I went, and I admit that in the past I haven't always felt like it was worth the cost of airfare and whatnot, but this time I really did. I got to meet some kindred spirits. And it was so refreshing to know that there are other people out there doing this kind of work. And so, you feel less alone. And I also want to mention that I did have one poem in an anthology recently that was titled Rewilding. It was published by Split Rock Press, Crystal Gibbons. And I was really amazed to see how many poets now are writing eco-poetry. I think the genre has just blossomed in the last 20 years. So I guess, just as an opener, have you, Alison and Ellen, noticed a surge like that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when I started out, I felt a little weird because everybody was, well, my friend Gary Paul Nabhan always said that, well, everything is nature writing except what's urban dysfunctional writing, but everything was urban dysfunctional writing, and I felt a little strange and like, well, what's the matter with her? She doesn't write about people, I didn't want to deal with this feeling of human exceptionalism, that all that mattered to me was human beings and our problems, and I've always had that feeling, which was odd when I started out in the 80s and 90s. But now, yes, I think you're absolutely right, Anne. And I think climate change and this awareness that we're living in the Anthropocene, it's just firing up people's grief, people's wish to speak of loss, to find ways to come together, to invite all these other species, as you both did, into our poems. I mean, I think it's a very exciting time for eco-poetry and eco-poetics, and I just couldn't be more thrilled to see what's happening now.
Yes, I agree completely with what both of you are saying. I think that that even those of us who may not have been attuned to this are now, you can't help but be. It's just impossible if you're a person who's paying any attention at all, and you're a writer, and when you sit down to write, you try to in some way access what is real and pay attention to it. So I think that even poets who don't maybe define themselves as eco-poets, that it's all coming into all of our poetry. It just can't stay out at this point.
Yeah.
So one, I've given a couple of talks about eco writing, and I love to go back in time and look at people that were doing things well before the genre was supposedly born. And one poem that I love to point to is The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and Wordsworth, because I don't know if you remember the poem well, but the mariner shot the albatross basically because he could, even though the bird had helped the sailors through this horrific, experience. And so then he alone survived to tell the tale. And then he goes and, he goes to the church and he accosts these people on the way to this wedding. And and tells about this, because this is his burden. This is the albatross that he's wearing around his neck.
Mhm.
But I've been doing a lot of research, trying to go back in time and see, who the precursors were. And I wonder if any of you have, I know it's kind of hard to come up with with poems or or writers just off the top of your head, but maybe someone springs to mind as being,
Mhm.
Well, this doesn't go back as far as the Ancient Mariner, which I just love you making that connection. I think that's really great. But I go back a lot to Susan Griffin in the 70s and her incredibly important book, Woman in Nature, which I don't think people who weren't adults at that time, younger people I don't think know about, but it's an extraordinary book in which she goes through the things that have been said through the centuries about women and the things that have been said about animals and nature and trees. And I don't know if you can even buy it new anymore, but probably you can. Maybe there's new editions. But I was giving a talk on eco poetry recently and read a fair amount from that book, because she is saying the things she allows all the animals to also have their voice. And it's a devastating book. And at that time in the 70s, I think, as that second wave of feminism, women's liberation, was coming into being, there was a lot of awareness of that connection between the way that women were discounted and destroyed and nature.
Right, right. Somebody has birds tweeting, and whoever has invited the birds, thanks. This is great. Yes.
This wonderful mockingbird who has
Beautiful.
been just marvelous in the past couple of months. Yeah,
I love it. Well, yes, I'm so happy you mentioned that, and I would mention Elizabeth Bishop. It was among our more recent ancestors in poetry, because her wonderful poems from Brazil, and the book Questions of Travel, the book Crusoe in England. I mean, she's not spoken of as an eco poet, but that sensibility is there. The power of place, the power of species, the power of the folk tales about species. That's all in Elizabeth Bishop, and she's one of our great poets. But I was really happy that you mentioned the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and that takes me back to the Romantics, of course. And for me, the least recognized and celebrated of the Romantics, who should be, is the poet John Clare. And I really recommend people look up John Clare, because I'm fascinated by the fisher people in the Bay of Fundy, where I spend the summers, because I think people who work in nature know nature really well, almost better than the scientists. And they know it differently, at least perhaps, than the scientists. And John Clare grew up at the time when it was possible as a peasant or as a person of low means to live very modestly and to work a plot of land. This was before the clearances, the Scottish clearances that kicked all those people off the lands so that the wealthy could occupy the lands. And John Clare is a great poet. His poems you can find online. And he also suffered from alcoholism and some kind of mental illness that today could be helped probably pharmaceutically, but he spent a great deal of his life in institutions of very inhumane nature. But I highly recommend that people look for his bird nest poems, because they're absolutely beautiful, and they're all the field observation, the specificity of the species, what they use to build their nests with, what their eggs looked like, the fragility of these birds' nests lying in an agricultural field where the horses are coming through with the plows. He got it, he got the observational detail, he got the beauty of nature, he got the fragility of nature. And I think John Clare, C-L-A-R-E, if you don't know him, is somebody to go back to see, someone who worked close to the land, and his spirit, and this is a person whose spirit was troubled, his spirit was deeply fed, and I think stabilized, if I could claim that, by his engagement with these vulnerable species.
Well, thank you for that, because I'm I don't know if, okay, waiting for my little picture to come up here, but anyway, yeah, I'm always looking for, I like to go back in history, and I like to see, who preceded us. And I also have to say that even though I do distinguish between, environmental, or I should say eco-poetry and nature poetry, I think there is a little bit of a separation there. I mean, we certainly owe a lot to nature poets, the English Romantics, the ancient Chinese poets, if you want to go way back, because, if you don't have that, that appreciation, then how can you write about devastation in a way? I mean, you have to start from that place of care and concern.
Mm-hmm. The other place to look is Camille Dungy's amazing anthology called Black Nature. That is a whole history of nature poems by African-American writers, deeply grounded in the history. It's a really magnificent, huge collection, and it helps us to see, whoa, if we're only looking at the white writers, we're missing a whole lot. So I highly recommend that as well.
Yeah, that's a great book. That's really great. But one poem after it's a fat book, and the poems are all so good.
I know.
And that I mean, there's so many anthologies now, but the other one that I think is very, very strong is the Eco Poetry Anthology that Anne Fisher-Worth and Laura, is it Gray Street? Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely agreed.
That also is just terrific. And the poems are so varied in both of these. That's one of the things that I like about both these anthologies, is that you don't read one poem after another that is doing essentially the same thing, even if it's doing it well. All the poems are coming from such different perspectives and angles and sensibilities, styles.
I just wanted to mention too that, I personally find that I use nonfiction a lot. Yeah, I'd like to slip in little bits of history here and there. And so I think it's really important for poets to read nonfiction. Otherwise we kind of get tunnel vision, I think. So just that's why I wanted to read those two examples, those poems where they were directly taken from those works, where the sea breaks its back and in the heart of the sea.
Mm-hmm.
So what are we missing here? We're getting close to our time. Is there some wrap-up thoughts that we want to part with?
Well, I think people always come to these sessions feeling a lot of grief and a lot of loss, and often a lot of futility. And maybe, I was really interested in when you mentioned hope and the different cultural readings of what hope might be. And I always remember, maybe we should talk about and give our listeners something to think about in terms of those feelings, which can silence us, they can silence us. And how do we find our voice so that we can make a contribution? And I think that's a really important thing for us to do, to bring people together, to be honest and share those feelings. It was in everybody's works, that we heard today. I don't know if you both have something that you'd like to add, or something that you'd like to add in about what you were saying about hope and the different senses of that you saw across cultures.
Well, I have to say I've become with age increasingly pessimistic, and so, but but there is this paradox, like here I am writing about it. I mean, if you're going to write, that is kind of a hopeful act, isn't it? Otherwise, you might as well just zip the mouth and. So I think the very act of writing is in some weird way hopeful.
Mhm. Mhm.
Even if you're writing about how you don't believe in hope.
Well, I think whenever we're talking to each other, that's a positive step, because it's when we stop talking, it's when we are completely silenced, that then we're really paralyzed. And I do love that the editors of All We Can Save, I listened to an interview with them a little while back, and they were asking about, the interviewer was asking about hope, and she said, fuck hope. I want action and solutions.
Yeah.
So I guess what I would say is that, I mean, if I say this, I don't completely, I believe both sides of this. I mean, we need hope, but I think there's a way in which we also can't, or for myself, I'll say, I can't think too much about whether things are hopeful. How are they going to turn out? Is it going to be all right? Will the human species survive? If I start getting too much into hope, then I don't really have very much power. I don't have very much, ability to just say, okay, what is the next thing that maybe I could do? So, whether this all turns out well or not, how do we want to live our lives? And, that gets me then grounded in a place where I'm not reliant on something that I can't predict, and it's not looking real rosy out there. We all know that. But if I can focus on, what can I do? And of course, not only writing, but the large and small things that we can do in our own lives that can feel too small. But of course, if we're all doing them, then they're not too small at all. And there's so many ways that, regardless of our circumstances, we can make small differences that add up. So it's that action and solutions that I really keep focusing on, rather than the hope part.
Can I bring in the late great poet W.S. Merwin here, because he helped me a lot think about this, and he worked so hard for conservation in Hawaii. Almost every cause he worked for, other than the palm forest he grew, failed. But he was speaking to a group of us in Arizona once, and everybody's getting more and more depressed talking about this stuff. And somebody said, well, are you at all hopeful? And he said, I am not optimistic, but I have hope. And that's a very different thing, because I make a decision to be hopeful. And then he gave this great analogy, and I've been telling it ever since he said it. So this is from W.S. Merwin. When we're in a lifeboat, it's not the time for our worst behavior. It's the time for our best behavior. And, that's a pretty decent motto to pick up what Ellen's saying about agency, So.
Well, since you bring up W.S. Merwin, I mean, I have to say one of my very favorite poems of all time is called The Last One. And
Yes.
He uses a tree as a metaphor, for human greed. But that poem is also filled with invective. I mean, it's a angry poem. But I think that reading things like that kind of gave me permission, it's like, it's okay. You can express those feelings.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think we're about to the end of our time here. Any last thoughts? I just want to say again that you're both such wonderful readers, and you're so smart, and you're such thinkers, and it's nice to know my tribe exists.
Feels good, doesn't it?
Yes.
I would like to just share from Marcel Proust, with a line that I think about a great deal, and actually you'll always have it taped up somewhere that I am. The purpose of the artist is to draw back the veil that leaves us indifferent before the universe.
Mm. Beautiful.